Tokyo, late summer 1944. The air inside the Imperial Japanese Navy General Staff Office is thick with tobacco smoke and fatigue. Ceiling fans hum over a long wooden table buried under maps. The Central Pacific, the Marianas, the Philippines. Circles drawn in red pencil mark where Japanese carriers once ruled the sea. Now, they mark where they vanished. A messenger enters quietly, placing a sealed report on the desk of Admiral Toyoda Soemu. The room stills. Toyota breaks the wax seal, unfolding a fresh U.S. intelligence summary. Numbers typed in neat English columns, translated beneath in Japanese. He stares for a long moment before passing it down the line. 2,034,343. That is the estimated number of active U.S. Navy personnel now in the Pacific and Atlantic combined. Someone mutters the old estimate. 296,000. A mistake, an impossibility, a number from another world. Outside, the sounds of air raid drills echo through Tokyo's streets. Inside, the admirals say nothing. They know what the figures mean. Japan had not miscalculated an enemy. It had miscalculated an entire industrial civilization at war. Before the smoke of war ever reached Tokyo's sky, Japan's naval leadership had placed its faith in precision, not production. In 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy stood among the most disciplined and technologically advanced forces on Earth. Its pilots were the best trained, its ships meticulously engineered, its carriers symbols of national pride and martial perfection. Every destroyer, every submarine, every man was expected to strike with exacting efficiency. For decades, Japan's military planners had watched the United States with wary calculation. American naval registers and intelligence from the 1930s painted a picture of a strong but predictable fleet. Roughly 296,000 active sailors, scattered across the Atlantic and Pacific, with a handful of modern carriers and battleships. It was a number that seemed conquerable. When Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto planned the attack on Pearl Harbor, that estimate lingered behind every order. Japan believed that by crippling the U.S. Pacific Fleet swiftly, by destroying its battleships, paralyzing its carrier force, it could force Washington to negotiate. The Japanese strategy was never built for a long war. It was designed for a knockout blow, followed by diplomacy. And at first, it worked. Pearl Harbor burned. The U.S. Asiatic Fleet retreated. Singapore fell. The rising sun flag flew across the Pacific Islands, from the Philippines to New Guinea. Japanese commanders celebrated a string of victories that seemed to confirm their calculations. America, they believed, would not have the stomach or the means to rebuild quickly. In Tokyo, reports of American ship losses filled the press. The morale was euphoric. Japan's naval staff, educated in the doctrines of Mahan and the lessons of Tsushima, believed in decisive battle, not attrition. Their navy was crafted for tactical brilliance, not industrial endurance. But what they could not see, what no Japanese officer truly grasped in 1942, was that, across the ocean, an entire civilization was awakening. Within days of Pearl Harbor, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had signed an order that transformed America from a peacetime republic into an arsenal of democracy. Shipyards in California, Virginia, and the Great Lakes ignited with a feverish rhythm of 24-hour production. Men and women flooded into factories. Car manufacturers built tanks. Automobile plants began turning out aircraft engines. Where Japan saw individual ships, America saw a system, a machine that could replicate war material on a scale the world had never imagined. By mid-1942, even as Japan struck into the Coral Sea and the Aleutians, new U.S. shipyards were already laying the keels of Essex-class carriers, vessels designed not as prestige projects, but as repeatable war machines. Dozens were commissioned in parallel, an industrial miracle that defied Japanese expectations. Japan's intelligence network, stretched thin across the Pacific, continued to report numbers. Carriers sighted, convoys intercepted, tonnage estimates, but these were fragments of a picture too vast to comprehend. Even as Japan's officers congratulated themselves on tactical victories, their enemy was building a new fleet faster than the old one could be sunk. By the time the Battle of Midway arrived in June 1942, Japan's naval intelligence still estimated U.S. manpower at under 500,000. The number seemed reasonable. It was, in fact, already obsolete. America's military bureaucracy had begun an unprecedented mobilization. Naval training centers in Great Lakes, Bainbridge, and San Diego were processing tens of thousands of recruits each month. To Japanese strategists, this was inconceivable. A navy was a work of art. Its crews trained over years, its ships the product of meticulous planning. To Americans, a navy was a product line. And that difference, cultural, industrial, and philosophical, would define the Pacific War. As 1943 dawned, Japan's victories began to stall. Guadalcanal became a graveyard of ships and men. Submarine warfare tightened around Japan's supply lines. The Imperial Navy began losing not only ships, but the irreplaceable air crews that had once given it dominance. And yet, Tokyo's intelligence estimates remained conservative. They still believed the U.S. Navy to be perhaps 1 million strong, immense, but finite. The truth was already far beyond that. Every week, new sailors were reporting for duty. Every month, new hulls slid from dry docks into the sea. The United States was no longer rebuilding. It was expanding. By early 1944, Japan's best analysts began to suspect the numbers were wrong. Reports from the Central Pacific described endless task forces, multiple carrier groups, where only one had been expected. Submarine sightings confirmed hundreds of new hulls. The ocean itself seemed to have changed color, gray with steel. And in Tokyo, behind closed doors, the realization began to take shape. Japan had entered a war not of ships, but of factories, not of courage, but of capacity. By the spring of 1944, Japan's admirals no longer trusted their own numbers. Every new report from the Central Pacific contradicted the last. Where intelligence officers expected a few American carrier groups, entire fleets now appeared, each with more ships than Japan could field in total. Reconnaissance aircraft radioed frantic sightings before vanishing beneath swarms of carrier-based fighters. At first, the Imperial Navy's analysts believed these were double counts or exaggerated pilot claims. But as the island-hopping campaign advanced, Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every island taken by U.S. forces required a sea of gray steel, stretching from horizon to horizon. Destroyers, escort carriers, fleet carriers, tankers, transports, hospital ships, all moving with mechanical precision, all replenished at sea, all supported by an industrial ocean Japan could neither map nor match. American industrial capacity had become its greatest weapon. In 1941, Japan had entered the war with 6 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, the pride of its navy. By 1944, the United States had commissioned 17 Essex-class carriers, with more still under construction. And behind them came the Independence-class light carriers, dozens of escort carriers, and a logistics fleet that could cross the Pacific without touching port. Tokyo's planners, long trained in the art of calculation, began to see the futility in numbers. The intelligence division's charts, once filled with red Japanese flags marking victory, now became a mosaic of American strength. Every attempt to project America's manpower ended in disbelief. Early in the war, their files listed 296,000 active U.S. Navy personnel, a number that made strategic sense. Japan had 300,000 of its own, roughly equal. But by late 1943, new figures began to circulate from foreign attachés and intercepted communications suggesting the U.S. Navy had surpassed 1 million men. The admirals dismissed it. Impossible, they said. America's shipyards might produce ships, but where would it find the men to sail them? The answer lay in America's total mobilization. From every corner of the continental United States, young men, farmers, students, machinists, teachers had joined the Navy in record numbers. Training stations expanded overnight. The Great Lakes Naval Training Station became a floating city of barracks and marching columns. Recruiters didn't turn men away. They assigned them to ship crews months before the vessels were even completed. This was something Japan could never replicate. Its industrial base was limited, its population stretched thin by years of continental war in China, and its oil supplies strangled by blockade. Every new ship Japan launched meant another resource drain from its empire. Steel from Manchuria, oil from the East Indies, time from a shrinking future. And yet, Japan's pride refused to yield. Its war planners continued to chase the idea of a decisive battle, the mythical Kantai-Kessen, where a single, perfectly executed strike could balance the war. The plan was beautiful on paper, elegant in theory, but in the world of 1944, it had become a relic. For across the ocean, America had embraced an entirely different kind of warfare, one built on logistics, rotation, and replacement. Ships no longer returned home to refit. They were resupplied at sea by floating warehouses. Sailors were rotated in waves, maintaining fresh crews even as battles raged. And as Japanese ships went down, American shipyards simply replaced them. Faster, cheaper, and in greater numbers than Japan could sink. Tokyo's war diary entries from this period reveal a tone of unease. Officers wrote of fleets that multiplied without limit, of carrier formations that seemed endless. Japan's best minds, men trained in naval mathematics and strategic theory, found themselves staring at statistics that defied reason. By June 1944, as U.S. task forces struck the Mariana Islands, Japan's intelligence section compiled a full reassessment. The final number stunned them. Across all theaters, the United States Navy now counted 34,343 personnel: sailors, airmen, logistics staff, and Marines under naval command. It was not merely a navy, it was an empire afloat. That report was hand-delivered to the Naval General Staff in Tokyo. It arrived with no fanfare, no ceremony, just another envelope in a war of reports. But inside, the truth had already decided Japan's fate. The empire that once dreamed of Pacific dominance now faced an enemy so vast it could replace in a month what Japan lost in a year, and within the silent halls of the Navy Ministry, the realization spread like a slow, invisible fire. The war was no longer about tactics. It was about time. The Japanese Navy's collapse wasn't caused by one mistake. It was the collision of 6 different realities, each more overwhelming than the last. To understand how an empire built on precision and discipline unraveled beneath a wave of American steel, we must look from multiple angles: industrial, human, and intelligence, where numbers became destiny. The industrial angle, the arsenal of democracy. Japan had believed in craftsmanship. America believed in mass production. That single difference defined the war at sea. In Japan, warships were built by hand, riveted, assembled, and finished under the watchful eyes of master shipwrights. Each vessel was a work of art, unique in its details and irreplaceable in its loss. When the carrier Shokaku went down at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, it was not just a ship destroyed. It was years of labor, a symbol of national pride, gone beneath the waves. In the United States, no such sentiment existed. The Essex-class carriers were designed for scale. Each could be constructed from modular sections in multiple shipyards at once. Newport News, Brooklyn, Philadelphia, San Francisco. If one dockyard was bombed or delayed, another continued the work seamlessly. The process mimicked industrial rhythm, not naval artistry. By 1943, the U.S. was launching a new combat vessel every single day. Destroyers rolled off production lines faster than Japan could count them. Liberty ships, simple, rugged cargo vessels, became the lifeblood of Allied logistics. Over 2,700 were built in just 4 years. Behind this miracle was manpower. At its wartime peak, the U.S. shipbuilding industry employed more than 1.7 million workers, many of them women. Their efficiency transformed raw materials, iron, oil, copper, into an unending tide of hulls. Japan could only watch. Its limited industrial capacity and shrinking access to resources made mass replacement impossible. Every sunk carrier, every lost tanker, hollowed its fleet beyond recovery. Where Japan built ships to last, America built them to win and to replace. The human angle. The sea of sailors, every ship is only as strong as the men who crew it. When the war began, Japan's navy had some of the finest sailors in the world. Men hardened by years at sea, trained in night torpedo attacks and complex fleet maneuvers. Their training schools emphasized discipline, tradition, and endurance. But the system had limits. Japan's training programs were long, selective, and rigid. Pilots took years to prepare. Technical specialists were irreplaceable. When these men died, and they did in staggering numbers after 1942, there was no second generation ready to take their place. In contrast, the U.S. Navy turned its vast manpower into a living factory. At Great Lakes Naval Training Station, recruits marched in columns 20 men wide, their breath fogging in the winter air. In San Diego, instructors drilled new sailors in gunnery and damage control under artificial smoke and flame. The process was industrialized, every task reduced to procedure, every sailor replaceable yet essential. By 1944, America had trained more sailors than Japan's total military population. From farm boys of Kansas to steel workers of Pittsburgh, the Navy became a mirror of the nation itself. Diverse, inexperienced, but endless. For Japanese intelligence officers, the realization came too late. Intercepted radio chatter from captured American ships suggested the presence of entire training divisions operating at sea. They began to understand. Every man Japan killed could be replaced. Every officer trained anew. Every fleet rebuilt stronger. Japan's own sailors, meanwhile, faced exhaustion. Long deployments, dwindling rations, and the constant presence of death eroded morale. The Imperial Navy's proud traditions began to collapse under the pressure of total war. The sea, once Japan's domain, now belonged to those who could fill it. The intelligence angle. Misreading an ocean, for any empire, intelligence is the compass of survival. For Japan, it became a blindfold. Before the war, Japanese naval intelligence was considered among the best in Asia. They intercepted signals, tracked enemy ship movements, and calculated American production through a network of observers. But their greatest weakness was assumption. The belief that America would fight as Japan did. Within finite limits, their early estimate, 296,000 U.S. Navy personnel, came from pre-war naval registers and diplomatic reports. It was accurate for 1940. But the pace of American mobilization after Pearl Harbor rendered it meaningless within months. By 1943, while Tokyo still operated on outdated numbers, the U.S. Navy had already tripled in size. Japan's intelligence services struggled with fragmentation. The Army and Navy operated separately, hoarding information. Communications between the Imperial Navy and foreign attachés were limited by code insecurity and resource shortages. Field reports were censored, delayed, or ignored if they contradicted official expectations. Meanwhile, The U.S. Navy's Office of Naval Intelligence, supported by radar, aerial reconnaissance, and cryptanalysis, had already penetrated Japan's operational codes. By 1942, the Americans knew more about Japan's fleet movements than Japan knew about its own enemy. When Japanese analysts finally received reports describing U.S. carrier task forces with unprecedented size, more than 100 escort ships, accompanying a single strike group, they dismissed it as exaggeration. It was unthinkable that any nation could field such numbers. But by mid-1944, denial became impossible. Interceptions, submarine sightings, and battlefield encounters confirmed the truth. American fleets were everywhere. Each time Japan sent ships to sea, they found more carriers, more destroyers, more aircraft than any intelligence model could predict. Japan had been fighting a shadow, the echo of a smaller America that no longer existed, and when the Imperial Navy finally confronted the scale of its miscalculation, it realized the war had already been decided long before the shooting stopped. The cracks in Japan's empire had begun to widen, not from defeat at sea, but from the realization that every strength they once held, precision, training, secrecy, had become irrelevant against an enemy defined by endless scale. As the Pacific turned against Japan, new perspectives revealed how total the imbalance had become. From the decisions of admirals to the loss of faith among sailors, every layer of the Imperial Navy reflected the same truth. The war was no longer winnable. The leadership angle. Yamamoto's warning, years before the catastrophe, one man had seen it coming. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Harvard-educated, fluent in English, and one of the few Japanese officers who had lived in America, understood the scale of his enemy better than anyone in Tokyo. He once wrote privately to a colleague, "If I am told to fight, I will run wild for 6 months. But after that, I have no expectation of success." He wasn't being modest. He was being mathematical. Yamamoto had witnessed the vastness of America firsthand. The miles of factories, the endless rail lines, the rhythm of a people who could work without pause. When war planning began, he warned Japan's leadership that a short war was possible, but a long one would end in ruin. His proposal for the Pearl Harbor attack was not born of arrogance, but of desperation, to cripple America before it could mobilize. But even Yamamoto's foresight could not stop Japan's political machinery. The Army demanded expansion. The Navy demanded prestige. The illusion of early victories silenced his warnings. By the time he was killed in 1943, shot down over Bougainville, the Empire's course was already set. After his death, his prophecy began to unfold word for word. Japan had run wild for 6 months, from December 1941 to June 1942, and then, inexorably, the tide turned. His successors, Admirals Nagumo, Koga, and Toyoda, inherited not strategy, but exhaustion. They were tasked with defending an empire that no longer had the ships, oil, or men to sustain it. Their conferences in Tokyo became rituals of denial. Maps filled with red lines that no longer connected to real fleets. Yamamoto's ghost lingered in every decision. His understanding of America's scale, its capacity to build, rebuild, and sustain, was now carved into the silence of the Navy Ministry. The admirals didn't need to read intelligence reports anymore. They could see the truth written in the Pacific horizon itself. The moral angle. Faith under the rising sun. For Japan's sailors, the sea had always been sacred. They were raised on stories of Tsushima, where Japan's fleet had destroyed the Russian Navy in 1905, proving to the world that an Asian nation could master modern warfare. That legacy was both a source of pride and a burden. By 1944, that faith was breaking. At first, defeats were explained away. Tactical setbacks, bad weather, unlucky strikes. But when entire fleets disappeared, 4 carriers at Midway, another at the Philippine Sea, even the most loyal sailors began to sense the truth. The Imperial Navy's code of honor demanded silence and sacrifice. Men were told to die for the Emperor rather than surrender. But as the war dragged on, loyalty collided with despair. Letters recovered after the war revealed the quiet doubts of sailors who had once believed their empire invincible. "We fight ships that never end," one wrote before the Battle of Leyte Gulf. "Each day more come. We sink them, and the next day they return." Tokyo's propaganda could no longer keep pace with the facts. Radio Tokyo spoke of glorious withdrawals and strategic redeployments, but the men at sea knew better. They watched their carriers burn, their comrades drown, and their commanders weep in silence. Faith, once Japan's greatest weapon, became its quietest casualty. By 1945, the Imperial Navy's sense of honor shifted from victory to endurance. Kamikaze tactics, once unthinkable, emerged not from fanaticism, but from hopelessness. Japan's pilots no longer believed they could defeat the enemy. They only sought to make their deaths meaningful, and as American fleets advanced, the moral weight of the empire's illusion grew unbearable. The rising sun, once a symbol of triumph, became a mark of tragedy. The technological angle, the engine of victory war, is not only fought with courage, but with tools, and by 1944, the U.S. Navy's technology had surpassed Japan's in every measurable way. Radar turned night into day. American ships could detect enemy planes before they appeared on the horizon. Japan's early radar systems, rushed into service, were unreliable and scarce. While Japanese destroyers relied on human lookouts, American warships fought with mathematics, computing firing solutions, coordinating entire task forces through electronic communication. Then came logistics, the hidden technology of war. The United States perfected underway replenishment, allowing ships to refuel and resupply without returning to port. Japan's navy, still bound by fixed bases and dwindling oil, had no such system. Every voyage consumed more fuel than could be replaced. The American machine extended beyond hardware. Its training programs used simulators and standardized curricula, producing sailors and pilots faster and more consistently. Aircraft like the Grumman F-6F Hellcat rolled off assembly lines faster than Japan could train new aviators. By 1944, the Hellcat's kill ratio against the Zero stood at nearly 19 sidros. For every Japanese advance, like the Long Lance torpedo or the deadly discipline of their carrier air groups, America produced an answer, and then scaled it beyond comprehension. The industrial logic of the United States meant that once a superior design appeared, it could be replicated thousands of times over. Japan's engineers designed brilliance. America's engineers designed abundance. That difference became lethal. By the end of 1944, all 6 angles converged into one undeniable truth. Japan's war machine had been outpaced not by brilliance or bravery, but by magnitude itself. Every battle Japan fought was already shaped by the imbalance of production, manpower, and technology. The ocean was no longer a battlefield. It was a factory floor. June 19, 1944. The Philippine Sea. Dawn breaks over a vast expanse of cobalt water. Hundreds of aircraft, Hellcats, Avengers, Dauntlesses, shimmer in the morning haze above an ocean of steel. Below them, the U.S. Fifth Fleet stretches across the horizon in perfect formation. 15 carriers, 7 battleships, 28 cruisers, and more than 100 destroyers. It is the greatest concentration of naval power in human history. To the west, Japan's remaining carriers advance under a fading sun. Their decks are lined with the last of the Imperial Navy's trained pilots, many barely out of flight school, some with fewer than 100 hours of combat experience. Their commanders call it Operation Ago. It is Japan's final attempt to halt the American advance through the Marianas, the last chance to protect the homeland from the bombers that will one day strike Tokyo itself. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding from the carrier Taiho, knows the odds. His fleet is short on fuel, his pilots untested, and his reconnaissance scattered. But orders are orders, and pride demands battle. The plan: lure the Americans eastward, strike from the air, and destroy their carriers before they can launch a decisive counterattack. It is a strategy drawn from an earlier war, and from an enemy that no longer exists. By mid-morning, American radar screens light up with a storm of blips, Japan's first wave of bombers approaching at long range. But unlike the desperate chaos of early battles, the U.S. response is methodical, almost mechanical. The combat information centers aboard the carriers Lexington and Enterprise plot intercept vectors. Hundreds of Hellcats are launched with machine precision. The phrase that echoes over the radios becomes immortal. Many bogeys. Bearing 270, Angels 12. Let's go get 'em. What follows will be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In less than 8 hours, the Imperial Japanese Navy loses over 400 aircraft, most of them shot down before they reach the American task force. Entire squadrons vanish without landing a single hit. Pilots who trained for years die in seconds, their planes spiraling into the sea. On the carrier Taiho, Ozawa receives the first reports in disbelief. The Americans aren't just fighting better, they're everywhere. Each time Japan launches a wave, another U.S. carrier group appears to replace it. By noon, American submarines, Albacore and Kavala, close in on Japan's flagship formation. Torpedoes streak through the water. The Taiho, Japan's newest carrier and pride of the fleet, is hit. A fuel explosion rips through its decks. Hours later, it sinks, taking hundreds of men with it. The U.S. fleet continues its assault without pause. By the end of the day, Japan has lost nearly all its carrier-based air power. 90% of its trained pilots gone. Its ability to defend the Pacific shattered. Aboard the U.S. flagship Enterprise, Admiral Raymond Spruance surveys the outcome with quiet finality. The victory is total, but not surprising. The U.S. Navy has reached a state of perfection in motion, constant replenishment, coordination, and communication. Its fleets operate like living organisms, fueled by an industrial bloodstream that never runs dry. Far away in Tokyo, word of the disaster arrives by radio at dawn. The Naval General Staff listens in silence as casualty lists grow longer. Carrier names once synonymous with victory, Shokaku, Zuikaku, Taiho, are now gone. Japan's dream of a decisive battle has ended not in triumph, but in annihilation. For the first time, the Imperial Navy faces the full weight of the American war machine in open ocean, and learns what it means to fight a nation that manufactures victory. The sea, once Japan's shield, has turned into its executioner. That evening, as Tokyo calculates the scale of its losses, a quiet panic sets in. Dispatches flood the Naval Ministry from regional commands, fuel shortages worsening, aircrew replacements impossible, ship construction halted for lack of steel. The numbers are no longer military statistics. They are symptoms of collapse. Admiral Toyota, now Commander-in-Chief of the combined fleet, writes a terse note in his diary, "The fleet exists only in name." The next morning, his intelligence officers deliver a supplementary report, intercepted American data revealing the total U.S. naval strength. When converted and verified, the final figure emerges: 34,243 active personnel. It is not just a number. It is the sum of everything Japan had failed to comprehend. The living measure of industrial warfare, of an enemy that could not be exhausted. And in that moment, for Japan's admirals, the war changes. No longer a contest of courage or strategy, it becomes a slow acknowledgement of inevitability. Pacific Ocean, autumn 1944 aboard the carrier USS Essex. The sea is calm, but the machinery of war never sleeps. Fuel hoses hiss. Deck crews move like clockwork, loading bombs under the wings of Avengers and Hellcats. Pilots gather on the briefing deck, staring at maps pinned beneath red strings. The next target, the Philippines, Leyte Gulf. Across the Pacific, in a darkened room in Tokyo, the surviving admirals of the combined fleet argue over a map of the same islands. Their empire, once stretching from Manchuria to the Solomons, has shrunk to scattered red pins, isolated garrisons starving in silence. Yet one belief remains: a decisive battle must still be fought. Admiral Takeo Kurita is chosen to lead the center force, the last major surface fleet Japan can muster. His orders are clear but desperate. Sail through the San Bernardino Strait, reach Leyte, and attack the American invasion fleet head-on. It is, in essence, a suicide mission. On October 23, 1944, the Japanese fleet moves out. Mighty on paper, hollow in reality. Yamato and Musashi, the largest battleships ever built, thunder through the Sibuyan Sea, their 18-inch guns symbols of a power that no longer exists. But as dawn rises, U.S. submarines Darter and Dace strike. 2 Japanese cruisers are sunk before the battle even begins. By the next day, as the fleet moves into the narrow waters of the Philippines, American carrier-based planes descend upon them like a storm of steel. Bomb after bomb crashes into the Musashi, each one tearing through armor designed for another era. By sunset, the behemoth rolls onto her side and sinks, taking over 1,000 men with her. Still, Kurita presses on. The Japanese Navy is fighting not for victory now, but for meaning. Meanwhile, U.S. Admiral William Bull Halsey, commanding the Third Fleet, receives intelligence that Japan's remaining carriers are to the north. What Halsey doesn't know is that they are decoys, empty decks meant to lure him away from Leyte. The trap works. Halsey charges north with all his carriers, leaving the San Bernardino Strait unguarded. At dawn on October 25th, Kurita's fleet emerges into the Gulf, directly behind a small, unprotected American escort group known as Taffy 3. The battle that follows is one of the most astonishing in naval history. On paper, Taffy 3 should have been obliterated. 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts against Japan's mightiest battleships. Yet what unfolds is chaos, courage, and confusion. U.S. destroyers charge headlong into the enemy line, firing torpedoes at ships 10 times their size. USS Johnston, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Ernest Evans, makes 3 separate attacks before being sunk. Survivors later recall Evans shouting over the intercom, "All hands, this is a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way." Overhead, American carrier planes, low on fuel, some unarmed, dive again and again, dropping anything they can. Depth charges, machine gun bursts, even flares. The Japanese commanders, overwhelmed by smoke, gunfire, and confusion, begin to believe they are facing a much larger fleet. After several hours of brutal exchange, Kurita makes an unthinkable decision. He retreats. When the smoke clears, the Japanese have lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, and numerous cruisers. The Imperial Navy, once the terror of the Pacific, will never again mount a major offensive. That same evening, Admiral Toyota receives the news in Tokyo. His staff records his reaction as silent resignation. The radio operators, Many still boys listen as the casualty figures are read. The combined fleet has ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. Across the ocean, in the American command ship USS New Jersey, Admiral Halsey's staff pins new victory flags to the wall. Yet there is no celebration, only motion. Ships refuel, new planes arrive, fresh crews replace the lost. The war machine does not rest. It expands. By the end of 1944, the U.S. Navy has 17 operational fleet carriers, 9 light carriers, and over 100 escort carriers. Shipyards in California, Washington, and Virginia run 24 hours a day. Carriers that take Japan 3 years to build roll out of American docks in less than 6 months. A secret Navy logistics report from that winter summarizes the imbalance in one sentence. For every Japanese carrier sunk, 2 new American carriers sail. Back in Tokyo, fuel is rationed to the point where even training flights are canceled. Ships remain anchored for lack of oil. Steel from half-finished destroyers is being melted down to build aircraft that may never fly. In the darkness of the Naval General Staff's bunker, one young officer whispers a question that no one answers. How do you fight a nation that manufactures the ocean itself? The silence that follows is not of discipline, but of realization. Japan's commanders now understand that their war is not against an army or a navy. It is against an idea, industrial modernity, mass production, and limitless manpower. A civilization that can turn metal into momentum faster than any empire can resist it. The Pacific has already chosen its victor. Tokyo. Winter, 1944. The walls of the Navy Ministry are cold and silent. Japan's Naval Command gathers around the long black table for what will be remembered as their last true meeting of war. The smell of burned paper lingers in the air. Intelligence files and fleet rosters being destroyed before American bombers can find them. The Battle of Leyte Gulf has ended, but its echoes reach farther than any explosion. For the first time, the Imperial Japanese Navy, once the pride of Asia, the envy of Europe, has been broken beyond recovery. Reports arrive daily, each one bleaker than the last. The Yamato has survived, but there is no fuel to move her. The Musashi lies beneath the Sibuyan Sea. The once mighty carrier force, Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, Chiyoda, is gone. The airmen who once struck Pearl Harbor are dead, replaced by hastily trained youths flying obsolete aircraft on dwindling supplies. The combined fleet, once counted in divisions, now fits on a single page. Tokyo's Intelligence Division finalizes a report, their first honest one since 1942. It confirms that the United States Navy now commands over 2 million active sailors, spread across 1,200 warships and thousands of support vessels. By comparison, Japan can crew fewer than 150 ships, many immobile, others crippled by lack of fuel. That single statistic tells the entire story. Japan's admirals read the report in silence. Some refuse to believe it. Others simply stare at the paper, their pens motionless. For years, they had measured strength by the number of ships, by tonnage, by firepower. But this is something entirely different. The Americans are no longer measured in ships. They are measured in systems, in shipyards, refineries, supply chains, men, and Japan has none left to spend. The effects ripple outward from the ministry to every harbor across the empire. At Kure, rows of submarines lie unfinished. At Yokosuka, aircraft carriers sit stripped of their fuel and engines, turned into static anti-aircraft platforms. At Truk Lagoon, once the Gibraltar of the Pacific, rusting hulks fill the lagoon like tombstones. Even the sailors sense it. Veterans speak quietly among themselves, that the sea, once theirs, has turned American. Meanwhile, in Washington, a new kind of naval warfare has taken shape. The Service Force, the logistical heart of the U.S. Navy, now operates as a floating continent. Oilers, ammunition ships, repair vessels, and mobile dry docks follow the fleet wherever it goes. Sailors sleep under artificial daylight, eat fresh bread baked aboard moving ships, and receive mail from home thousands of miles away. It is an empire without borders, an ocean of infrastructure. American intelligence soon intercepts fragments of Japan's despair. Translations of captured documents show their disbelief. Enemy naval personnel exceed 2 million. Impossible, yet confirmed. That admission spreads quietly through Allied command, proof that Japan knows it can no longer win. But despite the collapse, Japan fights on. Pride and duty override logic. Orders are issued to begin Toko, special attack units, later known as kamikaze. If Japan cannot outbuild or outnumber its enemy, it will sacrifice men instead. Planes are stripped of landing gear to save weight. Pilots are told their lives are weapons. In the harbors, young sailors watch as these aircraft take off and never return. Some cheer, others turn away. They all understand the same truth. This is no longer war. It is endurance. By early 1945, the once proud Imperial Navy is reduced to fragments. The Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, is ordered on a one-way mission to Okinawa, with only enough fuel to reach the island, not to return. Crews write farewell letters before departure. They know they are being sent to die, and somewhere deep within the Navy ministry, one intelligence officer opens the same folder that began the war. The estimate made in 1941, when Japan believed there were only 296,000 American sailors. He compares it to the latest figure, 2,034, 343. He does not speak. He simply closes the file, sets it aside, and whispers, "We never stood a chance." Outside, the sky over Tokyo glows red from distant fires. Not from battle, but from the slow burning of a nation's illusions. The sea that once promised glory now carries only defeat. But as Japan sinks deeper into the shadow of 1945, a new question begins to rise. What comes after total naval collapse? Spring 1945, the end of the Imperial Navy in April, the sea off Kyushu is calm, eerily calm, as the giant battleship Yamato steams south for Okinawa. She carries over 3,000 men and just enough fuel to reach the island. Her guns, each weighing as much as a locomotive, have been polished for one last act. There are no illusions aboard. Every sailor knows this is a suicide mission dressed as strategy. American submarines pick up her trail almost immediately. By noon on April 7, 1945, aircraft from Task Force 58 swarm over the horizon. More than 300 planes descend on Yamato and her escorts. Bombs and torpedoes strike in waves. 8, 10, 12 hits, until the ship lists heavily to port. At 2:23 p.m., the most powerful warship ever built rolls over and explodes in a blinding column of smoke and fire. The blast is so immense that it is seen 100 miles away. The Imperial Japanese Navy dies with her. In Tokyo, the news is met with silence. The last symbol of Japan's naval pride has been erased in a single afternoon. The admirals who remain in uniform stop speaking of strategy. Their reports grow short, then vanish altogether. By summer, American bombers rule the skies, and Japan's remaining ships are trapped in their harbors, motionless, useless, and starving for oil. When the U.S. Navy begins its final strikes against Japan's coastal cities, there are no fleets left to resist, no convoys to protect. The ports of Kure, Sasebo, and Yokosuka become graveyards of steel. The U.S. Pacific Fleet now numbers more than 1,000 combat vessels, with another 2,000 auxiliary ships in constant motion. Entire task forces operate independently, supported by mobile fuel depots, hospital ships, and repair bases that move like cities across the sea. For every Japanese ship sunk, America builds 2 more before the month ends, and as the Allied invasion of Okinawa unfolds, the difference between the two nations becomes almost biblical in scale. Where Japan sends pilots with 200 liters of fuel, America sends floating airfields that never empty. Where Japan's destroyers sit rusting, America's shipyards launch new ones weekly. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addresses his nation by radio for the first time in history. His voice trembles as he announces Japan's surrender. In the harbors, sailors drop their rifles, not from fear, but from exhaustion. They have fought as hard as men can fight, and lost to something far greater than courage or tactics. When U.S. occupation forces arrive weeks later, they find a navy that has ceased to exist. Some ships have been scuttled to prevent capture. Others are half-built, half-sunk, or turned into barracks. The Japanese sailors who remain stand in perfect silence as American officers inspect their bases. There is no ceremony, no salute, just the sound of boots on metal and the distant rhythm of waves. In the months that follow, the Imperial Navy is formally dissolved. Surviving vessels are divided among the Allied powers as war reparations. Many are later sunk as targets or scrapped for metal. The sea, once Japan's greatest weapon, becomes its grave. For the United States, victory brings reflection, not celebration. In less than 4 years, the U.S. Navy had transformed from a peacetime force of 296,000 sailors into a global armada of over 2 million men and women, supported by an industrial machine unlike anything the world had ever seen. This transformation reshaped warfare itself. Never again would victory depend solely on battles won at sea, but on who could sustain the fight the longest. American strategists begin to study the lessons of the Pacific. They understand now that Japan's defeat was not a collapse of courage, but of capacity. Japan could fight bravely, even brilliantly, but not endlessly. In post-war Tokyo, as the U.S. Navy anchors in the once forbidden waters of Yokosuka, a quiet realization spreads among the Japanese officers who remain. The age of empire has ended. The age of industry has begun. Ships that once symbolized power now symbolize permanence. The sea belongs not to those who claim it, but to those who can fill it. And somewhere in a dusty archive, beneath the ruins of the old Naval General Staff, a single document remains. Yellowed, water-stained, forgotten. It lists 2 numbers, handwritten in neat military script. U.S. Navy personnel, 1941, 296,000. U.S. Navy personnel, 1945, 2,034,343. Below it, a final note, scrawled in fading ink. The ocean cannot be conquered by courage alone. The empire that sought to master the Pacific had drowned in its own calculations. But from those ashes, a new world had begun to rise. The Pacific is calm again. No fleets, no gunfire, only the long, slow heartbeat of the sea. Where once thousands of ships moved in endless formation, now the water carries silence and memory. Beneath its surface lie the bones of 2 empires, one that dreamed of domination and another that learned to outbuild time itself. Japan's war had begun with precision, planning, and faith in human skill. It ended beneath the weight of machines. The Imperial Navy, once defined by discipline and daring, discovered that courage, however boundless, cannot outlast industry. The numbers tell the story more honestly than any survivor ever could. In 4 years, America turned its factories into shipyards, its workers into sailors, and its raw resources into power. 2 million men at sea, 17 fleet carriers, 1,000 destroyers, all born from a nation that believed the ocean could be measured, mastered, and multiplied. Japan's admirals had once tried to count their enemy's strength, estimating 296,000 sailors. When they finally discovered the truth, 343, it wasn't just a statistic. It was a revelation. That war, in the modern age, belongs not to the bravest, but to the prepared. And yet, beyond the numbers, there remains something deeper, a quiet, human truth. Every ship built, every carrier launched, every man counted was a life bound to the ocean. Each one carried hope, fear, and the unspoken question that outlives every war. Was it worth it? When peace came, the world looked across the Pacific and saw not victory or defeat, but transformation. The sea that once divided nations had become the proving ground of a new era, one ruled by production, logistics, and relentless momentum. The Japanese Navy vanished, but its legacy endured. In the lessons of balance, restraint, and humility it left behind. The United States, victorious yet sobered, emerged with the same realization. Industrial strength could win wars, but only wisdom could prevent the next one. Today, the ocean still carries the rusted ghosts of that struggle, silent monuments to a time when numbers became destiny. And somewhere, in the quiet rhythm of the waves, echoes a single truth whispered by history itself. Empires are not lost in battle. They are lost in the arithmetic of time.